тебя уже задняя скорость включена, как ты только представь, нахуй. А не то, что она упала, ты начинаешь дрочилкой, блядь, выключать скорость, блядь.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we're back in War Thunder and we're looking at one of the new aircraft which came in update 1.75. This is the Yak-4. It is a rank 1 battle rating 2.3 Russian, I suppose they call it a light bomber. I would call it more of a jack of all trades, master of none kind of thing. But yeah, it's a light bomber in the tree. You find it at rank 1 at 2.3. And, well, it has two brothers as well. You have the Yak-2 KABB, which I will also cover in a separate video, and also the I-29, which was a special gift vehicle for doing one of the events. Now, when the I-29 came about, it was very obvious that we were going to get a Yak-2 and a Yak-4. It just really depended on which variants we were going to get. So they went for the standard Yak-4, and then they also went for the KABB version of the Yak-2, which is one which is more heavily armed. If we look at the armor profile of the Yak-4, all you find on it, armor-wise, is the seat itself for the pilot, which is 8mm. So this thing's pretty weak when it comes to people shooting at it. Not a lot of armor to defend against. And it also has two VK105R 12-cylinder inline engines. They're water-cooled and around about 1,000 horsepower apiece. For me personally, I don't find them that great, quite low on the, well, I suppose power side, or at least it feels like it. Maybe the aircraft itself is just incredibly heavy. At the same time, if we look at the X-ray, you have a oil cooling system here at the front, and then the liquid cooling system at the back. So as long as you shoot at an engine, you're always going to hit this liquid cooling system, making the engine overheat incredibly quickly in the space of maybe at most 5 minutes, maybe at least around about a minute. And this is a plane which cannot run on one engine, or at least it really struggles to do so. So therefore, once you hit one of these engines, you can pretty much just say that it's gone for garters. At the same time, it does have a 7.62mm Shikass machine gun in the back. The Shikass machine gun is probably one of the best in the game just because of its high fire rate, and as a turret is pretty good as well. When we look at offensive armaments, the Yak-4 only has one 7.62mm Shikass, but at least it is completely centrally mounted, which means that you don't have to worry about convergence at all. If we look at the modifications for this machine, the only bombs you actually get are 8 500s, which you unlock when you research the aircraft. So as you can see over here, there are no bomb loads or anything you have to unlock. This is just here straight off the bat. They are sat in a set of 4 on the outside, so 1, 2, 3, 4. The outer ones drop first, then the inner ones in sets of 2. And then you have a little bomb bay door set up here, or a bomb bay I should say, which holds 4 100s, and they all drop at the same time. What is interesting is you don't actually get a bombing sight in the Yak-4, even though there seems to be some kind of situation where the guy in the turret could actually be able to line up the bombs. But unfortunately, yeah, you don't get a bomb sight, which is kind of annoying, to be honest. The cockpit itself on the inside looks very nice, even though it is still a cockpit holder, or placeholder I should say. And if I talk about which modifications to go for first, to be honest, I don't really know. The best ones, in my opinion, are just the flight performance ones, because the fact that you're going to get hit a lot in this machine, because it's not as fast as a lot of the monoplanes that you find around 2.3, what's going to happen is they're going to chase you down. So speed will at least elongate the time that you have alive, and the survivability stuff doesn't seem to do anything. The Yak-4 gets shot down very quickly as long as just a few rounds are landed on it. And when it comes to the offensive weaponries, well, if you want to use this more as a ground attacker, well, I mean, just use the Yak-2. Because it's at the same BR, and it has 220s and two 7.62s, and also it still gets an attacker spawn, whereas the light bomber variant gets a bomber spawn, but you don't get a bomb sight. So yeah, you can see the issues that I'm already bringing up here. It's not... Well, when we get into the gameplay, we'll talk more about it. So we're going to go into the history of the Yak-4, and we're also going to do some gameplay. There is no different skin either. I mean, generally the only other skin you might get is without decals, but overall I still think it's a nice skin. When we talk about what belts to go for, pretty much all of the Shikast belts are pretty good, apart from default. So I use Tracer because it's API, API-T, but that's very, very similar to Universal apart from the AI round. I just use API because, you know, I'm generally going after ground targets more, and Stealth is good as well. The back gunner, I prefer the armored targets, API, API, API-T, whereas Universal is API-T, 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 AI. Once again, just the same reason, just have that extra AP. It's just so if you land around, you know that it's going to penetrate, or at least it has the most chance of penetrating an enemy target. And yeah, it's pretty much as simple as that when it comes to all of this aircraft. Let's get into some historical talks. So in the historical part for the Yak-4, we're going to do a general overview of the Yak-4, the Yak-2, and also some of its predecessors and other prototypes and things like that. When we talk about the Yak-2 and its historical parts, we'll talk about how in the actual battles themselves, when we look at the Yak-2 and the Yak-4, they didn't perform as well as were expected. So that's pretty much how I'm going to do this. So the Yak-4 was an improved version of the Yak-2. It had some more powerful engines in it, the Klimov M105s, and it also had a ton of other changes, which were basically trying to upgrade the Yak-2 into something useful. There was 2 additional fuel tanks which were added to the outer wings, and it brought the total capacity for fuel to 180 liters, and also the gunner's canopy was bulged to give more room, so a 7.62mm could be used to more effect. Also, the upper fuselage was redesigned. This was to improve the gunner's field of fire, and also oil coolers were relocated from the sides of the engine nacelles to the chin position to improve performance. So that's pretty much the differences between the Yak-4 and the Yak-2, so let's talk about how these machines came about. So originally, the plan was to create some kind of high-speed reconnaissance aircraft. So the Yakovlevs came up with the YA-22 prototype. It was powered by 2 M103 engines, and it made its maiden flight on the 22nd of February 1939. It was a 2-seat, lone-wing monoplane with wooden wings and a fuselage of mixed construction. The YA-22 had retractable tailwheel landing gear and a tail unit which incorporated a twin fin and rudder assembly. So this thing was made of a mixture of wood and metal, which is kind of interesting. Also, the Yakovlev was then instructed to modify the design to serve as a bomber. So they didn't just want a reconnaissance aircraft, they wanted it to be made into other roles as well, which makes sense. You want a bit of versatility behind your aircraft. This aircraft, which was being modified, was redesignated the BB-22, or the Blizny Bombardirovitchik. I hope I said that right. If I didn't, I apologize. Which means short-range bomber. This resulted in some major revisions of the accommodation of where the pilot sits, the armament, and also the fuel storage, plus the provision of an internal bomb bay. Obviously, a bomber needs a bomb bay. The first series BB-22 was completed on the 31st of December 1939, and it was actually flown on skis on the 20th of February 1940, which is kind of interesting. If you've ever seen any of the old pictures of some of the I-16s, you'll see them on skis. Maybe one day we'll get them in the game. I highly doubt it, though. It seems kind of pointless. But by the time the 2 factories were in production, and also the experimental variants were coming around, you had the R-12 photographic reconnaissance aircraft and also the I-29 or the BB-22IS. Now we actually have this in game in the form of the I-29, the heavy fighter, the pretty much better version of the Yak-4 KABB, which we now have in game. So yeah, that was another prototype which was going around, and that was going to be the long-range escort fighter variant of this model. They were being prepared for test flights, and then the BB-22 was redesignated to the Yak-2 at the end of 1940, and as powered by two 716 kilowatt M103V engines, had a maximum speed of around 530 kilometers an hour at sea level, and a service ceiling of around 8,800 meters and a range of 800 kilometers, so pretty good. And then in 1940, the basic design was further refined to improve the crew positions, field of view, and also armor protection, which doesn't seem to be shown in game, but at least, you know, they did in real life. The M105 engines were introduced, with better protection for the fuel system, and also provisions made for external bomb racks, so you could carry bombs on the outside. This is why, if you look at the Yak-2 in game, it is able to carry 4 100s, where the Yak-4 is able to carry 8 100s, because the Yak-2 did not have the external bomb points, whereas the Yak-4 did. So then it was redesignated the Yak-4 after all of these changes, and the aircraft entered production in the autumn of 1940, and about 600 of both versions were built, the majority of them being Yak-4 since they were seen as the superior version. They were not particularly successful in service, and many of them were lost in the early days of Operation Barbarossa. So, unfortunate, ending for the machine, but you can see how they got there, and it's kind of interesting how they didn't just go for the Yak-2 and the Yak-4, they actually went for the Yak-2 KABB, and I'm guessing the fact is because otherwise the Yak-2 and the Yak-4 would be incredibly similar in their role in the game. The only difference, one carries 8 100s and the other one carries 4. At least now you have a little bit of separation with the guns that they use and also the turret, since the normal Yak-2, the bomber version, did have a turret. The one that we have in game does not, because, well, it's the more attacker version that they created. But anyway, we'll get into the actual, the fighting of this machine and its issues and, how well it did when we look at the Yak-2. But for now, that's a general overview of where this came from and the design decisions which led us to the Yak-4. So let's get into some gameplay. Something that I brought up about the P40C the other day really resonates at the same time with the Yak-4, but in a slightly different way. So when I talked about the P40C, I talked about the difference between a turn fighter and an energy fighter, their different roles in the game, and the issues of when you get stuck between those roles, and the hardships that you can get, especially when you're against experienced players. The Yak-4 is in a very similar mode, but not because of, the matchups that you face, but because of its actual role in the battle. I did a review on a PE3, I believe it was the PE3E, the early version, like maybe 3 or 4 years ago now at this point, and I basically talked about how the issue with it is that it's stuck in two minds with the role that it wants to play in the battlefield, and the role that it was actually designed for in real life doesn't really have a place in the game. And now, 3 or 4 years on, we now have a new vehicle, in the form of a Yak-4, which is having exactly the same problems. At 2.3, the Russians have quite an interesting lineup, especially when it comes to the fighters. You've got the Yak-7B, the MiG-315BK, the Lag-335, the Yak-1, the I-16 Type 24, all of these really good aircraft. And then when we look at bombers, you have the AR-2, you also have the SB2M103U-MV3, and the SB2M103MV3 as well, and also the DB3B at 2.7. So what you have around this BR and at this BR is a bunch of aircraft which fulfill the roles that you do, but in a much better way. And the Yak-4 in a light bomber role, what you're trying to look for is something very similar to what you would find on the D4Y2 when I talked about those aircraft. The idea that you want to strike a balance between being able to do damage to ground forces and be kind of bait against the enemies coming in so your fighters can jump up on them. So therefore in this role it can do a pretty good job. The question is this role viable, and wouldn't it just be better, you know, playing another vehicle, being able to actually do something more useful? So the first issue with the Yak-4, actually no, let's go through the positives. So the first positive is that this machine is pretty quick. It's still not going to outpace the majority of aircraft that you face, but it's going to be comparative to them, especially if you drop off your bombs. At the same time, having the turret in the back is very nice as a defensive gunner. The Shikass machine gun is probably one of the best, especially at lower levels when it comes to defensive armaments. The maneuverability of this twin-engined machine is very good, especially compared to a lot of other twin-engine machines. I would actually compare it to the Breda 88, apart from it's slightly more maneuverable and slightly quicker in the versatility range. So therefore, if you've flown the Breda, you have the feeling of the Yak-4, basically. And in that case, it is good. You know, it's maneuverable for a twin-engine fighter. Is it as maneuverable as a one-engine? No, because the majority of the time you face Spitfires and they're able to outmaneuver you because, well, they're Spitfires compared to your heavy twin-engine bomber. Are you going to outpace them? No, because you're in a Yak-4 and it's too heavy, and their max speed is faster than yours. Your good matchup, I suppose you could call it, is something where you face a lot of other attacker aircrafts, maybe A-20Gs, stuff like that, and they start turning with you and you're able to outturn them. The issue is with the majority of fights that you'll take a battle rating 2.3, this just won't happen and you'll get mauled by aircraft. So that's pretty much the positives of it. You know, it's quick or quick enough for what it is, it's maneuverable for what it is, and it's got a good turret on it. So let's get into the negatives. The fact that this only has one 7.62 millimeter machine gun in the front is okay, but the issue is you have many aircraft around this BR, especially when we look at its brother, the Yak-2 KABB, which just outshines it massively. When you're comparing one 7.62mm Shikass machine gun against two 20s and two 7.62s, and the speed that you get from the Yak-4, an extra 30 kilometers an hour, which you actually lose when you actually add bombs to the damn thing, I don't think is a good enough reason to actually lose those extra guns. Also at the same time, because you don't have the bomb reticle, you have to go low to the ground if you want to be able to bomb effectively. So because of that, what happens is you get close to the ground, and then you want to go after light targets, and then you realize you only have one 7.62mm Shikass. And yes, the 7.62mm Shikass is a great machine gun for going after ground targets, especially if you look at belts such as its tracer belt. The issue is that you only get one of them, and you only get 500 rounds. At the same time, you have to defend yourself against oncoming aircraft. So because of all of that, the Yak-4 struggles in that area, because you have to go low to the ground. Yes, you are quick, but everything else is faster. It's just, you know, an unfortunate thing. So let's compare it to the majority of things that you're going to face, so fighters, pretty much. The one thing that you can do in the Yak-4, which is not the same as some other heavy fighters, where you basically just have to hold your ground. The heavy fighters I'm referencing here is stuff like the A-20, the BF-110 in its current state, the Beaufighter. A lot of these machines, you are not really able to maneuver that well, and you have to fight your way out of a situation. The Yak-4 does have the edge over those machines on maneuverability, so you are able to you know, turn pretty well and be able to avoid that first pass. So if your team is like 2 or 3 or 4k away from you, and you have to evade the pass of a few aircraft which are coming down on you, yes, you can easily do that. If you are on your own though, which, you know, you find yourself in a lot of the times because you dive at the start of a battle from bomber the bomber altitude to the battle to try and get your bombs off and then be able to fight, then yeah, you're going to have a few more issues. But you can counteract that by changing the playstyle if you feel like it. I don't think it's worth it though. So overall, with the Yak-4 in that sense, you can dodge the first shot quite easily, which does set it apart from a lot of other heavy fighters of this BR. The BF-110 may also be able to dodge, but it's not as good as the Yak-4, especially when we look at the size of the machine. So your survivability goes up slightly there. What is another issue with the machine is the fact that when you look at the engines, if your engine even gets hit once, it has no armor on it, and the liquid cooling system will get popped straight away. So you're at that point pretty much on a timer. These engines already overheat on their own at 100%, but it is only around or after about 5 or 10 minutes, so it's not that bad. But the issue is, once the liquid cooling system is popped, you have to get back to the airfield as soon as possible, because the water is going to fall out quicker than you will imagine. So once that's happened, you're left with one engine, and even with full upgrades, it's very hard to keep the Yak-4 in the air with just one engine. At the same time, you don't have combat flaps, so therefore you can't use them to try and feather your way in. You are pretty much just stuck with landing flaps, but the landing flaps themselves actually come out incredibly slowly. So if you are paying attention enough, you can actually just open and close them very slightly over and over and over again, and it'll give you that combat feel, very much similar how you would use a Spitfire's flaps, or very much similar to how you would use the other Yaks that you get flaps, because that will give you the combat flap feel, but you don't actually have the combat flaps behind you. At the same time, with that said, if you don't actually get hit in the engines, generally this thing isn't actually that flimsy. The only thing flimsy about it is its engines. I haven't ever had where the elevator just falls off, or the tail just falls off, or a wing just falls off. Every time I die in this thing, it's to my engines just giving up and me puttering out. At the same time, because this is a rank 1 aircraft, I feel like a lot of people are going to get pilot knocked in it, just because it doesn't really have any armor for the pilot and the gunner. Now for me, because I have pretty good crews on my Russians now, generally that won't happen, but I feel like it could be an issue for the majority of players. So remember that detail if you are putting it into a lower crew. And the biggest bugbear that I have of this machine is the fact that at the same BR you have the Yak-2 KABB. Now the Yak-2 KABB is a machine which is better than the Yak-4 in pretty much every single way, or is comparable. The only difference is, where the Yak-4 has a slight advantage, is speed, which is negated because of the bombs that you have to carry, and the fact that it can carry 4 extra 100 kilos. And fine, if you want to hit a base a little bit harder, or maybe hit, if you're really good with 100 kilos and you're able to get 4 ground targets with it, or maybe you're in ground realistic and you get some really good bombs off, then yeah, that's great. But the issue is, in the Yak-2, the 9 out of 10 times it's going to be more useful because its role in the battle. It's going to be much more of a supportive machine than it is a bombing machine. And I just don't see a reason why to take a Yak-4 over a Yak-2 at this point in time. I don't also, if I want to bomb something, like I've talked about before in Air Realistic, you have basically 2 sets. You have the medium heavy bombers, and then you have the fighters. Everything else really struggles for a role. So therefore the Yak-4 falls into this area. It falls into this area where it doesn't have a role. So when I think, okay, I want to go bomb something, well, why don't I just take the AR-2 or some of the SBs that are on offer? The AR-2, at this moment in time, carries 6 100s, 6 250s if you wanted to. It also carries 3 500s, and also has access to a front 7.62 in the form of a turret, so it has more ammunition than you do, and also it has the back gunners as well. Yes, it's a bigger machine, yes, it's slightly slower, but the majority of the time it's going to take people to get up to you, and also you're going to be able to do more on the first pass, which makes more sense. If I want to take it out to be that defensive fighter to try and help out my team, why don't I just take out the Yak-1? Why don't I just take out the I-16? How about the Yak-7B? How about the MiG-3BK? How about the Lag-335? You see how stacked 2-3 is for the Russians now, and you're going to add in a light bomber, which is, well, it just doesn't do anything well compared to these machines. So yeah, the two designated paths in Air Realistic that people generally go down and seems to be the main meta of the game, you know, the fighters and then the bombers, are already taken in the 2-3 slot. So the only reason why I would take a Yak-4 is to take it into ground realistic as a kind of nippy bomber if I don't want to get shot. So let's try and have a look at what 2-3 lineup you can set up. I mean, you got the Su-76, solid tank destroyer, has a few issues, especially if people are shooting it in the air. T-80, 2.3, I mean, it's okay. The T-50s, 2.7, so that's out of the bag. Because if you're at 2.7, you take the IL-2 1941. Well, maybe you could take the Yak-4, but I think the IL-2 is better. If you're at 2.3, you can also take the first T-28. You can also take the 72K Gaz MM, so you can kind of make something, you know, a ground force around it. So let's say T-28, T-80, Su-76, and if you're not feeling as confident, you change one of them for a 72K Gaz. Like, you can form a thing around it. Now, why would I take a Yak-4 over a Yak-2 in that battle? Well, the only reason to do that is for the 4-100s, and the 4-100s are mounted on the wings, so you can only hit 2 targets with them since they drop 2 at a time. So you're pretty much is going, right, well, I want to kill 2 more targets on the ground and be useless in the air. I think the majority of players would go for the aircraft, the Yak-2, which has the ability with the 20mm to be able to nail opposing aircraft, and also at the same time to penetrate quite highly at 27mm with the AP rounds. So that can actually go through the top of a lot of machines that you fight. Yes, it has slightly weaker engines, but as I talked about in the game, it isn't really represented that much. So I find it, even if, let's say, you take out the medium bombers and the fighters, which fill the roles much better than your Yak-4, why do I take the Yak-4 over the Yak-2? That is my main question right now. And I can't think of it, or I can't think of an answer unless it's to kill 2 more ground targets, which you could probably do in the Yak-2 anyway, but lose all of the help that you can do in the air battle that's going on. So overall, would I recommend using this machine? No, not really. I just don't see a point in it. If you want to fly a machine like this, you fly the Yak-2, and if you want to stick to the meta of the game, then you play any of the fighters at 2-3, or you play the AR-2, which is a really fun medium bomber. I mean, it's classed as a light bomber in game. I would see it as more of a medium bomber. But it is fun to fly. It has some really nice turrets on it. It's incredibly maneuverable, and it's a really nice like starter bomber if you want to get used to that kind of medium/heavy bomber role. So yeah, an unfortunate thing for the Yak-4, but you know, let's get into next time where I'll talk about the Yak-2, which is much more interesting. I'll see you then.